She told him in her last letter. She thought that would be the end of it. He was waiting on the platform anyway. Colorado, in the dry autumn of 1878, was a country of thin grass and thinner rain, and the rail platform at Larkspur Junction stood nearly empty the afternoon the eastbound train came in carrying a woman who had traveled 400 miles alone with a folded cane and a heart braced for rejection. Cole Bannon stood at the end of that platform in his one good coat, a lean, sun-weathered rancher of 36, whose 800 acres along Cottonwood Creek had gone 3 dry years running, and now carried a note at the Larkspur Bank that would come due, in full, the following spring, a debt he had answered, in some desperate reckoning of his own loneliness and need, by placing an advertisement for a wife in a Denver paper, because a man drowning quietly in worry finds it easier, sometimes, to solve the ache of an empty house than to solve the harder arithmetic of an empty ledger. Sadie Marlow had answered that advertisement with a letter so plainly and warmly written that Cole had read it 3 times before he ever wrote back, and they had corresponded 4 months. And it was only in her final letter, the one that came the week before her train ticket, that she told him the truth she had been too afraid to lead with. "I must tell you before I come, so that you may still refuse me honestly," the letter had read. "I lost my sight 2 years ago, to a fever that near killed me outright, and left me blind instead, which some days I think was the crueler mercy. I can keep a house and a garden, and I have learned, since, to do a great many things without my eyes that most sighted women would not credit possible. But I understand if a rancher wants a wife who can see his cattle and his children grow, and if you write back and tell me not to come, I will think none the worse of you, only of my own foolishness in waiting this long to say it." Cole Bannon had read that letter standing in his own kitchen with the lamp guttering, and he had sat down afterward and written back 4 short lines, and had not told her, because there had not been room in 4 lines to tell her properly, that he had spent that whole evening thinking less about her blindness than about the plain, unflinching courage it had taken her to write it at all, knowing what she believed it would cost her. So when the train doors opened, and a slight woman in a gray traveling dress stepped down uncertain onto the platform boards, her cane sweeping a careful arc before her, her face already composed for the rejection she had spent 400 miles rehearsing how to bear, Cole Bannon crossed the platform and took her free hand in both of his, plain and steady, and said the only thing that seemed worth saying. "I know," Cole said, "and I'm still here." Sadie Marlow went very still on the platform boards, her cane forgotten at her side, her whole face caught between disbelief and a hope she had trained herself, over 2 long and hard years, never to let rise too high. "You read my letter," she said. "The whole of it." 3 times, Cole said. "I'd have come to that platform if you'd written me a page of nothing but troubles, Miss Marlow, on account of I asked you to marry me before I ever knew about your eyes, and I don't recall the offer having eyes as a condition attached to it." He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm, careful, unhurried, wagons just past the depot. Ground's uneven the first 20 yards. I'll tell you when it changes. And that was the whole of their meeting on the platform. No speeches, no tears, only a rancher's plain hand and a plainer promise kept. And Sadie Marlow climbed up into the wagon beside a man she had never once seen, and had already, in the space of one held breath, begun to trust more than she had trusted anyone in 2 years of careful, guarded living. They rode out to the Cottonwood Creek place in the long gold light of afternoon, and Cole talked the whole way, unprompted, in a manner Sadie would only later learn was entirely unlike him, describing the mesa on the left, the dry creek bed, the shape of his own low ranch house waiting at the end of the lane, because he had understood, without needing to be told. that a blind woman riding into a strange country wanted the world narrated to her, not left as silence for her to fear. The house, when they reached it, was a modest thing of pine and river stone, plain but sound, and Cole walked her through every room slow and thorough that first evening, naming each doorway and each piece of furniture, and letting her own hands learn the shape of the place at her own unhurried pace. And before the light failed entirely, he took her back outside, and walked her the length of the yard with a coil of stout rope over his shoulder, and began, without asking her leave, to string it from the kitchen door to the well, and from the well to the barn, waist high, knotted at each turning, so that a woman who could not see the yard might still walk it alone, safely, by the simple guide of her own hand along a rope. "Rope'll want checking after a hard wind," Cole said, testing the last knot with his weight. "But it'll hold. I'd rather you walk this yard free and easy than have to call a hand every time you want the well or the barn. A woman ought to be able to move about her own home without asking leave of anybody." Sadie stood in the darkening yard with her fingers on the taut rope and something in her chest, guarded shut for 2 long years, came loose at last. "Nobody has ever built me a thing before, Mr. Bannon," she said. "They have only ever built around me, as though I were furniture to be stepped past." "Well," Cole said, gruff, with a feeling he did not entirely know how to name yet, "you ain't furniture on this place. Come on in. Supper's getting cold, and I expect you'll cook it better than I do, once you've learned where I keep the salt." The days that followed built into something Cole Bannon had no name for, and had stopped believing, after 3 dry years, was owed to a man like him. Sadie learned his kitchen by the 2nd week, and ran it better than he ever had alone, her hands quick and sure over the stove, her ears catching the particular hiss that told her a pot was near boiling over before Cole, sighted, would have noticed it all. She learned his ranch's rooms and its rope-strung yard until she moved through both with an ease that startled the hands who came to know her, and she brought with her, too, a sharp practical mind that Cole found himself, more and more, consulting on matters he had once shouldered alone, for a blind woman, it turned out, listens a great deal more closely than a sighted one to the things people say and the things they leave unsaid. And Sadie Marlow's ear for a false note in a man's voice proved, before that first month was out, considerably keener than Cole's own eye for a false note in a ledger. It was over that ledger, in fact, that Cole first learned how much more than a housekeeper he had brought home. He had been muttering over the bank's note one evening, the sum of it and the drought's toll on the herd, and Sadie had asked him to read the figures aloud, slow, and had sat with her head tilted, listening, the way she listened to everything, and had said, at the end of it, "You are counting the herd at last year's price. Mr. Bannon and cattle have gone up $11 a head at the Denver stockyard since the spring drive, on account of the eastern demand the newspapers were reading me about on the train. Sell what you can spare before the first snow, at this year's price, and I believe your note troubles you a good deal less than you think." Cole had sat back from the table and looked at his wife, for they had married that same first week, quiet and plain, at the circuit preacher's next visit, with the particular startled respect of a man discovering, later than he ought to have, that he had underestimated someone badly. "You've a sharper head for figures than I do," Cole said, "and you can't even see the page." "I don't need to see the page, Cole Bannon," Sadie said, and there was the faintest edge of old hurt beneath the humor in it. "I only ever needed somebody willing to read it to me instead of deciding, ahead of time, that I hadn't the sense to understand it once they had." It was on an evening not long after that the careful, businesslike distance between them nearly gave way to something neither of them had yet found the courage to name. They had taken to sitting on the porch after supper while the last light went out of the mesa, Cole describing the color of it each evening, the way he had that first afternoon in the wagon, and Sadie listening with her face turned toward the sound of his voice as though it were itself a kind of sunset she could follow. "Sky's gone the color of a ripe peach tonight," Cole said, "streaked through with a purple I don't rightly have the words for. Never was much good with words, Sadie. I can tell you the price of a steer to the penny, and I go clean stupid trying to tell a woman what a sunset looks like." "You are better at it than you credit yourself," Sadie said softly. "I have not seen a color in 2 years, Cole Bannon, and some evenings, when you describe one plain and unhurried the way you do, I believe I can nearly recall what peach truly looked like before. That is no small gift you keep giving me, whether you know the words for it or not." He had reached, without quite deciding to still her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and for a long moment neither of them moved, his rough fingers over her smaller ones. The sunset going from peach to ash above the mesa, neither of them was watching any longer. The whole quiet yard holding its breath around the two of them, the way it does before a first snow. Sadie did not pull away. Cole did not press further. It would have taken nothing at all, in that suspended moment, for the evening to become something else entirely, and both of them felt exactly how little it would take, and neither of them, that particular night, was quite ready to be the one who closed the last of the distance. "It's getting on toward cold," Cole said at last, low, and did not move his hand for a good while yet before he finally did. "It is," Sadie agreed, and did not point out that neither of them had so much as shivered. There was one person in the county, however, who had already decided a great many things about Sadie Marlow before ever troubling to meet her, and her name was Winifred Cargill. Winifred was a handsome widow of Cole's own age who had made her interest in him plain to the whole county for 2 years running, certain, in the particular way of a woman accustomed to being wanted, that a lonely rancher 3 years without a wife would come round to her eventually, and she had received the news of a mail-order bride, sight unseen, as an inconvenience, and the news of that bride's blindness, once the whispers reached town, as an opportunity. A blind wife, Winifred reasoned, was a wife who could be shown, plainly and publicly, to be no wife at all, unfit to run a rancher's household, a burden dressed up as a helpmate, and a county convinced of that much might yet persuade Cole Bannon he had made a foolish, pitying mistake he was still young enough to correct. She began small. A whispered word here, a pointed comment there at the dry goods store, wondering aloud whether poor Mr. Bannon quite understood what he had taken on, whether a blind woman could truly be trusted alone in a house with a hot stove and sharp knives, whether it was not, in fact, a species of cruelty to leave a helpless woman to manage a ranch household unsupervised. It was slow poison, and it found some soil to take root in, for a county unused to a blind woman's competence is easily persuaded to doubt it sight unseen, no pun intended by the doubters themselves. Before the first snow came down off the Rockies, and it would, soon enough, the way the mountain winter always did, there was a stretch of golden autumn weeks at the Cottonwood Creek place. The rope strung taut across the yard, a ledger balanced at last, a marriage settling into something neither of them had dared name yet, but both of them, plainly, wanted to keep. If you have stayed with this story so far, stay a little longer. What happens next is the part that changes everything. And if tales of love that outlast the hardest country the West could offer are the kind that keep you company, the small bell beneath this story is how we go on meeting like this. Winifred Cargill's first real move came at the church social in November, in front of half the county, when she steered Sadie, with false solicitude, toward a table she knew perfectly well had just been moved, and stood back to watch the blind woman stumble into it before a room full of witnesses. A small, deniable cruelty, the sort that leaves no mark a court could weigh, and one that struck exactly as Winifred intended, for Sadie caught herself hard against the table's edge and went scarlet with the particular shame of a public fall. And a ripple of pitying, doubtful murmurs went round the room that did more damage to the county's confidence in her than any open insult could have managed. Cole was at her side in an instant, furious in a way the county had rarely seen from him. That table was against the far wall not 10 minutes past, he said, low and hard, looking straight at Winifred. Somebody moved it since, and somebody steered my wife toward it right after. I'll not name names in a church hall, Mrs. Cargill, but I've a fair notion who benefits most from my wife looking a fool in front of Larkspur. I am sure I do not know what you mean, Mr. Bannon, Winifred said. All wounded innocence. Beyond hoping poor Mrs. Bannon takes no lasting hurt from an accident that could happen to anyone. Sadie herself, unable to see the pitying faces turned her way, but perfectly able to hear the particular hush that had followed her stumble, understood exactly what had been done to her, and said so, quiet and level, once Cole had walked her to a chair. "You need not defend me so loudly, Cole," she murmured, her hand finding his sleeve. "I have known women like Mrs. Cargill before. They want the room to see me fall and forget, in the noise of it, that I got back up again without anybody's help." She lifted her chin toward the murmuring hall, unable to see a single face in it, and needing to see none of them to know exactly what they were thinking. Let them whisper. I have survived 2 years of whispers a great deal crueler than anything Larkspur has the nerve for. But the whispers did their work regardless, the way slow poison always does, and it did not end there, for Winifred Cargill, having tested the county's appetite for doubt and found it willing, made her second and far more dangerous move 3 weeks later, on a bitter December night, when Cole was away at the Larkspur Bank arguing his note, and a fire broke out in the barn. It was no accident. A lantern had been left burning low and close to the hay, in a spot Cole never left one, and Winifred, who had ridden out under cover of the early dark meaning only to frighten Sadie into some public panic that would prove her helpless once and for all, had misjudged how fast dry hay took flame in a Colorado wind, and found herself, within minutes, watching a fire she had lit spread far beyond anything she had intended, with the hired hand Jim trapped inside trying to free the horses, and smoke already rolling thick across the yard. Sadie Bannon heard the horses screaming before she smelled the smoke, sharp and sudden through her bedroom window, and where a sighted woman new to that yard might have frozen at the sight of flame or blundered blind into worse danger fumbling for a lamp she did not need, Sadie did the one thing 2 years of hard-won independence had taught her better than anyone else in that county could have. Managed, she went straight to the rope. She was out the kitchen door in her nightgown and bare feet before she had fully reasoned out what was happening, one hand finding the taut guideline at once, familiar as her own name, and she went hand over hand through smoke that would have blinded a seeing woman just as thoroughly as her own darkness always was, the roar of the flames growing, the heat pressing against her skin like a wall, her bare feet finding the frozen ruts of the yard by memory rather than sight, out past the well and onto the barn door, calling Jim's name into the roar of it. The barn itself was a wall of sound and heat, timbers cracking somewhere above her, and it was her ear, trained sharp by 2 years of listening for what her eyes could not tell her, that caught the hired hand's choked coughing off to her left, where his own smoke-blinded eyes could not find the door at all, turned around and stumbling deeper into the smoke, rather than out of it. Jim. This way, follow my voice, not your eyes. They'll lie to you in this smoke, same as they never once lied to me. She called, and kept calling, steady, unbroken, until his groping hand found her sleeve, and she turned them both back toward the door by nothing but the rope's own sure guide and the plain certainty of a woman who had spent 2 years learning to trust her hands over her eyes long before that night ever demanded it of her. She got him out into the clean, freezing air, and then, rather than stop, went back along the rope a second time and cut the halter ropes on the 2 remaining horses with a boot knife she had not known she still carried the nerve to use, driving the screaming, wild-eyed animals loose into the corral before the other hands, roused at last by the glow against the low clouds, came pounding up from the bunkhouse at all. It was Winifred Cargill, white-faced and horrified at what her small cruelty had grown into, who was found by those same hands still frozen at the edge of the yard, unable to make herself flee the scene of a fire she had lit, and could not now pretend she had not seen Ketch. She confessed the whole of it before the night was out, sobbing. To a county sheriff summoned by the blaze, her carefully arranged composure gone entirely to pieces in the firelight. "I never meant it to catch so fast," Winifred said, wringing her hands, unable to look at the ruin of the barn or at the soot-streaked woman being led from it very much alive. "I only meant to frighten her, to leave a lantern low enough that she'd have to feel her way to the trouble and be caught out unable to manage it, so the county would see plain what I have said all along, that a blind woman has no business running a rancher's house. I never once meant a real fire. The wind took it faster than any lantern ought to burn, and I could not make my feet move to stop it or to call for help. I only stood here watching what I had started, and I am ashamed before God of every part of it." She looked, at last, toward Sadie, and something like true horror crossed her face. "You might have died in there. Jim might have died in there. And you walked into it anyway, on nothing but a rope, to save a man who could see the smoke plainer than you ever could." "I walked into it," Sadie said, quiet but entirely unbowed, "because I have spent 2 years learning to trust exactly what you spent one evening trying to prove I could not be trusted with. You wanted the county to see me helpless, Mrs. Cargill. Instead, they will remember, the whole rest of their lives, precisely what a woman you called helpless did, with nothing but a length of rope and her own 2 hands, while the woman who could see everything stood frozen at the edge of the yard and did nothing at all." Cole came riding back from Larkspur near midnight, having heard nothing of the fire until he crested the last rise and saw the orange glow against the low clouds, and put his heels to the horse the rest of the way in a fright that near stopped his own heart, to find his barn a smoking ruin and his wife, soot blackened and singed at the sleeve, but entirely, gloriously alive, being embraced by a hired hand she had just pulled from a fire with nothing but a length of rope and her own unshaken nerve. "She saved Jim's life, Mr. Bannon," the foreman told him, before Cole could get a word out at all. "Went straight into the smoke on that rope of yours like she'd done it 100 times. Weren't none of the rest of us could have found him half so fast, seeing or no." Cole crossed the yard and took his wife's face in his soot-streaked hands, and for a moment could not speak at all. "I built you that rope so you'd never need rescuing in your own yard," he said finally, rough. "I never once figured on you doing the rescuing with it instead. Nobody ever built me anything that let me be of use before you, Cole Bannon," Sadie said, leaning into his hands, exhausted and entirely unafraid. "I only ever needed the chance. Mrs. Cargill gave me the fire. You gave me the rope. Between the two of you, I expect I came out the better bargain." Winifred Cargill left Larkspur County within the month, her reputation in ruins far more thoroughly than any whisper she had ever aimed at Sadie. Unable to show her face at church or dry goods store without meeting the same cold silence she had once hoped to turn on someone else entirely. The county that had half believed a blind woman helpless now told, over every dinner table for a decade after, the story of the night she had walked into a burning barn by feel alone and hauled a grown man out of the smoke, and the story that traveled with it, always, was the tale of the rope her husband had strung across the yard, and what it had proven about a woman the whole county had so nearly agreed to underestimate. By the following spring the barn stood raised again, larger and better built than the one the fire had taken. The whole county turning out to help with the raising the way frontier neighbors did once they had settled which side of a story they meant to stand on. The note at the Larkspur Bank was paid down early, in good part on the strength of a stockyard sale Sadie had counseled to the very weak and the very price, and the hands who had once watched her with pity now sought her out for her sharp ear on every matter from cattle prices to weather, having learned, the hard way, exactly how much a person could see who had stopped being permitted to look, away from listening. Cole and Sadie Bannon raised 3 children on that Cottonwood Creek ranch in the years that followed, and every one of them, from the time they could walk, learned the rope yard the same patient way their mother had, hand over hand, trusting the guide, until the whole family could cross that yard blind in a night storm, without a single misstep, because Cole had never once taken the rope down, long after Sadie herself had grown so familiar with the place she scarcely needed it. Jim stayed on at the Cottonwood Creek place the rest of his working life, and told the story of that December night to every new hand hired on afterward, embellishing it a little more fondly with each telling, until the tale of the blind woman who had walked into a burning barn on nothing but a rope and pulled a grown man out of the smoke had become, in the particular way of frontier stories, less a piece of gossip than a piece of the ranch's own history, the kind told at branding time and at Christmas, the kind children asked to hear again. The county, for its part, never again spoke of Sadie Bannon's blindness as anything but the plain fact it was, and a good deal less remarkable, in the end, than her nerve she was asked in later years to sit on the school board and to arbitrate more than one dispute over water rights, on the strength of an ear the whole valley had come to trust above most sighted men's judgment. It stayed strung between the house and the well and the barn for 30 years, mended and renewed as ropes wear, not because anyone still needed the safety of it, but because Sadie Bannon liked, some evenings, to walk out and rest her hand on the taut line and remember exactly what a man's plain, unflinching kindness on a train platform had once given her. Not sight, which no rope or husband could restore, but the plain, hard-won certainty that she had never once, in all the years after, been furniture to be stepped past again. Cole took to describing the sunset to her every evening of their marriage without fail, long after either of them could have said which of them needed the telling more. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where love arrived not in spite of a hard truth, but because of the courage it took to tell it, then this story was for you. Out on the dry, high country of Colorado, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Cole Bannon and the woman who stepped off a train blind and unafraid became the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real. She told him the truth, expecting it to end everything. He was waiting on the platform anyway, and he never once let go. If stories of frontier love that endured through hardship, doubt, and the kind of quiet courage only the West seems to demand speak to something in you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.